City University Television presents the American Theater Wing Seminars. Working in the theater. This seminar, critics.
Welcome to the American Theater Wing's Working in the Theater Seminars, now in their 26th year, and just one of the many year-round programs of the American Theater Wing. These seminars are coming to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, the new Graduate Center. These seminars offer a rare opportunity to explore with our panelists the realities of working in the theater. Today, we visit the world of the theater critics. Traditionally, the critic has sometimes been viewed as the enemy within, but not today. During this seminar, we will talk about our panelists' work ethics and perhaps how they see their role as a critic. I'm Isabel Stevenson, Chairman of the Board of the American Theater Wing, and now I would like to introduce our moderators, two very distinguished theater professionals, Pia Lindstrom, a former critic, and Harvey Sabinson, for many years the executive director of the League of American Theaters and Producers and a longtime press agent. I'll now turn this over to our moderators, Pia and Harvey.
Thank you very much, Isabel. On my far right, we have Charles Isherwood, who is the chief theater critic for Variety, which, as you know, is the show business Bible. Before that, he was the senior editor and theater critic in Los Angeles for Variety. And before that, he worked for L.A. Style, and he's a graduate of Stanford University. Next to him is Peter Marks. He's the New York Times critic, the dreaded New York Times. We know the power of the Times. Before that, he was a reporter and feature editor for the Times, the Arts and Leisure section. He worked as a reporter for Newsday, and he's a Yale graduate. Harvey, who's on your side?
On my side, on my far left, is Roma Torrey, whom I'm sure you will all recognize as the anchor for News All Day on News One. And Roma also reviews theater and the arts for News One in New York. She also, in the past, has been at News 12 in Long Island, where she began her career as a critic. To her right, not left, is Clive Barnes, the eminent critic of the New York Post. Clive speaks better English than most of us, because he was born in Britain. And he came to the United States to become principal dance critic of the New York Times, later also assuming the job of drama critic. When he left the Times, he joined the New York Post, where he has been for many years. And of course, Clive has written many books on the theater and on dance. And to Clive's right is Linda Weiner. Linda, for many years, has been the principal critic and arts columnist for Newsday. Linda also was the critic for the Chicago Tribune, and also when she came to New York, worked for the Daily News as a critic, and also for USA Today, and has been, as I say, for many years, reviewing both dance and theater for Newsday.
We have with us people who are insiders, like Charles, writing for theater, knowledgeable theater people. We have television, we have print media here. I'm curious how reviews are styled for different audiences. I'll start with you, Roma, because I'm particularly fond of television. Mm-hmm. And I know that we on television have to do a review that's different than a print. What do you do to your...
Well, right, we have to deal with two elements that my colleagues in the print profession don't have to deal with. One is time, and the other is the picture. In terms of time, our reviews have to fit into a slot. Now, I'm luckier than most, and I know you probably battle this all the time at News Channel 4. My reviews must run 3 minutes or less. And I think that would have been a luxury for you at Channel 4.
Yeah.
So you have to get it all in that brief period of time, and there's so much to say and so much material to cover. It's very frustrating. The other issue I have to deal with is matching the pictures to the words. And I was just telling Clive that it's often very difficult because I'm trying to broaden my horizons as a theater critic and not do as much Broadway and try to focus on off-Broadway. And the difficulty is that we have to shoot our own clips. And oftentimes the shooting is not very accomplished. And just at the moment, one of the characters is about to say something that is very momentous in the review, or for my purposes in the review. The camera wanders off to another character, or it pulls out of focus. So it's very difficult because in my line of work, we have to match the pictures to the words. And so if I don't have the appropriate pictures to match what I'm trying to say, I cannot use it. And that explains sometimes why the reviews occasionally seem a little disjointed or lacking a particular focus, because I have to deal with what I have, and what I have is oftentimes not adequate.
What about writing for people in the business?
Yes, I have my own constraints. I don't have to match words and pictures, of course. I'm just dealing with words. But I am writing for an audience that is either working in or obsessed with showbiz. So it's a very specialized crowd. But in fact, it doesn't really shape your critical response. I mean, that is going to be what it is. Variety does always address the issue of whether a show is going to be, a B.O. smash, if it's going to be boffo, which is a word we invented once upon a time, although certainly I didn't do it, or if it's going to be a flop. And I think in consumer papers you really would not feel right probably doing that, but that's something that I'm allowed to do. Of course, that means that half the time I'm wrong, but
That's
A
part of
critic
it.
who admits he's wrong.
in this one respect.
He's new.
Clive, you've worked at the Times and now you're at the Post.
Yes.
Do you write differently for the Post?
No, I don't think I do. I might, but I don't think I do. I always imagined that when I was hired by the Post, they hired me to write as I was writing on the Times. I think it's rather a mistake for people to change their style. I think that when they change their style, I've seen people do this, and editors hire someone because they like the way they write, and then they join a paper. This was particularly true of the New York Times, actually. People trying to think that they ought to write like the New York Times wrote. And usually it proved quite disastrous. I think that by the time people get to the age of 25, 30, something like that, they usually have their own style, and it's best to keep to it. Very often one, as arts critics, one very often finds oneself standing out from the rest of the paper by virtue of style. I mean, you're quite different from the rest of the paper. I often wonder who reads me, but it is it is a very different, and I think people usually keep to their own style, should keep to their own style, if it works.
Yeah, I mean, there is no one style of writing at the
No.
New York Times as there is at
No.
any of our publications.
exactly.
And really, first and foremost, I think try to find a voice that feels like it's expressing you. And if the trick is somehow to make that voice something that people connect with,
Yeah.
which doesn't happen overnight. When I started, I was plucked from the reporter side of the newspaper to be a critic, which is not the most common way that a critic becomes a critic at the New York Times. And I was terrified at first at the idea of holding forth in the pages of the New York Times. And it took me a few times before I could actually look at my own reviews. And sometimes I pick them up and say, who's writing this stuff? Who is this guy? I mean, what is he
An
put
outer
out?
ego.
And slowly you become, you learn to accept that you're just one person who happens to be given this opportunity, and you try to be sort of humble about it and not too grandiose. And over time you realize that, you hope that the world out there understands that anybody basically could be expressing their opinion. It's just a matter of how you express it and how well you express it.
I think it's very important to have a personal voice and to stop this kind of idea of this is the received opinion. I think that this is why the use of the personal pronoun and things like that are very important. The I factor, I think, is important.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Right.
One can really overdo it.
Oh,
I
yes,
think
yes.
think that one can really. I think that you.
You want me to count?
I also write a column, and in the column I use the personal pronoun a lot more, sort of a politics of the arts column weekly. But in the reviews, I try to keep of course, it's my own opinion. It's clearly you don't write. There's no such thing as objective opinions. When people say, "Gee, I wish I want an objective review," nonsense. It's oxymoron. But I do tend to write a little bit more in terms of the tone, a little bit more neutrally in the review, because I would find that if someone has the personal pronoun 6 times in the first 2 paragraphs, I get really bored.
Yes.
I think, oh yeah, but what's really happening on the stage? Are we much more interested in your own psyche?
Yes, yes, yes.
Have you ever wanted to write something over? I mean, that you did a review and then 3 weeks later said, my goodness,
Who
I
hasn't?
changed my mind.
You mean really change your mind? You mean just not fine-tune it or something,
No,
or find a better
have
lead?
a different opinion.
Well, nowadays, when critics are not impelled to cover opening nights and write that night, as they
You're
did
human.
in past years, there's an opportunity to rewrite that review.
Yes, yes, but you don't have an opportunity to
You won't.
re-see the show.
Yeah.
Usually.
Yeah, I think she means, say, oops, never mind.
Yeah.
Well, because I've had trouble with Stephen Sondheim, for example. If the first time you go and see Sweeney Todd, you walk out and you say, what have I seen? I've got 10 minutes to write this review. I don't understand the set, the music. I'd like to listen to it again. I don't have any time. And I would bring that confusion, and then later say, my goodness, I wish I could have seen that play a few more times and had
Well, I was actually curious about that, Pia. Were you going on opening night?
Yes, we
That's
used to.
different.
We used to.
Yeah.
You get some days.
We get very often as much as 3 or 4 days, depending. And obviously, though, the
Right.
crunch of time makes it not
Because
necessarily.
we used not to. We used to go
Right.
on the. We used to actually sometimes have about an hour, didn't
What
we?
was the
About an
earliest?
hour.
What was the earliest deadlines you ever had?
I suppose at the times we were about 11:15.
Oh, that's...
And that wasn't too bad. But remember,
That was
you know,
with an
one
early
was-
curtain?
That was with an early curtain, but we were writing. We were writing about 800 words, and then we would go up and check the proofs and.
Isn't there a famous story that Brooks Atkinson did not, because the show was running so late, did not see the end of Streetcar Named
That's
Desire
true.
when he wrote his review?
Oh, God.
No sympathy for.
Which do you think is better? Do you think it's better that you get more time? I mean, is there a trade-off in terms of what you get out of?
I think it's much better to have more time.
Haven't you found on occasion, though, that your opinion has changed? I mean, you've gone 180 degrees on a particular show. If you've had the luxury of 2 or 3 days in advance to write that review.
No, I don't find that, but what I do find, and that is, with dance is very much a continuum. You go and see the same things time after time. And I do find that my opinions of ballets change or dances change. And therefore, I wonder how much my opinions of plays would change if I saw them
The
time
same
and time again.
over.
You'd
Or
hate them all.
productions. I'd
You'd
hate them all. you think.
But over like 2 or 3 days, if you have more time to reflect on
Oh,
a
yes.
performance or on what the
Yes,
meaning of a
yes,
don't
yes,
you find that
yes,
it does
yes.
take a different shape?
It's
your
much better. And
visceral
also,
reaction?
one of the most terrible things about doing it overnight in that incredible rush, and Pia will remember this because it must have been worse for her in many ways, but one of the things that you were at the mercy of your opening paragraph. Because you did your first page and a copy boy would take it away.
They really were boys.
Oh
and
yes,
they
were
were
really
boys.
They were boys. They were that high. And they used to run in like little ants and they used to grab your pages away from you. And if you got the first page wrong, I don't say the opinion, but the tone of the review, which is in a way more important than the opinion, in the final effect. You were completely lost. I mean, it was, and that did happen sometimes.
I want to find out what brought this change about in writing for opening night. At one time, it was a 7:30 or 8 o'clock curtain, and the reviewer was a very good reviewer, New York Times, whoever it might have been, and a good, lengthy review of it. It's now coming in sometimes 2 days before opening night, sometimes, and it's now 6 o'clock.
Well,
Well, I know exactly what.
yeah, I know exactly.
Why? I don't know why. Why? Who wanted to
I've
do
heard a
did
lot of
that?
different stories. Let's have it now.
Now,
I want the
what
back
is it?
now.
Okay.
I can tell you in 2 words.
Yes?
Stanley Kaufman.
Okay.
What are the
Not
two
Thank you.
really,
Thank
no.
you, Stanley.
No, Stanley Kaufman, you know, because after Stanley Kaufman, the thing went straight back to the opening night reviews.
For a
Because,
short
I mean, I
period of time.
succeeded Stanley, no, Walter succeeded Stanley, but Walter was doing opening night reviews and I was doing opening night reviews. We didn't actually go back until Amadeus. And what happened with Amadeus was the Times went to, it bought tickets to Amadeus before bought tickets to one of the previews and wrote a notice.
Was this you?
No, it wasn't me. It was
Who?
Frank. It was
Okay,
Frank.
Frank
Rich. And Frank wrote a notice, and it appeared in the first edition, which was rather a mistake. Because my editor was in Sardis at the opening night party and got the first edition of the Times, which was out before the curtain fell. And there was a review in it.
He was
And
good.
He was quick. And my editor rang me up and said, well, you know, what the hell was happening? And I was at a loss, and I think, with Milda Busky, I think, was the press agent on Amadeus, if I remember rightly. And I rang up Merle in the middle of my notice, because I'd been called up in the middle of my notice, and I screamed, and he said, no, I didn't know this, I'm as puzzled as you are, which I didn't believe, of course, but apparently it was true. But still, and after that, the Post and the News and everyone went to the, you know, League of something, I suppose, and it was decreed that everyone was able to go to.
But isn't it true that one of the advantages of that opening night and that short deadline is that you knew the critic's opinion right away? Now you have to
Now you have to
go
wait.
into the review.
Yes, I know,
Advantage.
but
And in
that
some
only
cases-
from the business point of view. I mean, really, does it really matter whether you know the critic's opinions right away? It's only the press agent and the producers who want to know this. Yeah. No one. The world isn't waiting.
No, but there's a
I
high
understand you
degree
still see,
right away.
you still see the reviews at the same time.
Yeah.
Do you mean that the leads
No,
that you
they
would
don't,
find
because
the
they used
opinion-
to be on the 11 o'clock news that night.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
But now, very often in
it's still-
television,
No,
it
but
isn't.
also
It's
when-
maybe
when-
the next
when you
night,
read
it's the
Brooks
next
Atkinson-
day.
Night, isn't it?
Brooks Atkinson's opinion was in the first paragraph.
Oh,
then he summarized
That's
the
what you
play.
meant.
Yeah.
He meant,
And
he
went
meant,
into the elements, and then
Yeah.
his opinion then
yeah.
reappeared.
He
in the
meant
last
thumbs up, thumbs
paragraph.
down in the first
In the first
paragraph.
paragraph.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's for you. Now we're artistes.
But you still get the notices at the same time.
No, he meant
Oh,
the
of course,
opinions
yeah.
up,
Yeah.
up higher.
Oh, I see.
Right.
That
you
the
get the-
opinions
Oh,
up
I
higher.
see. Oh,
Get
I
them
see.
earlier now.
The
I
writing
think
was
the
more
other-
coherent? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, I think the other advantage to later deadlines is that, and that this may be totally irrelevant to you, but we are able to have more of a normal life. Now, it may not, that may seem irrelevant, but I think it isn't irrelevant that when you have critics, because when I was at the Chicago Tribune for 11 years, we had an 11:30 deadline at night, and I often didn't know if the swan died or not, you know. And by the time I got to New York, fortunately, Frank had had his way, and you know, you guys, so we're able to be a little bit more civilized about it. And I think being able to go to the theater and go home and have, you know, have a life with people makes us a little bit more like everyone else in terms of seeing the theater.
that's a good
In
point.
terms of, because I know I had a life that was completely upside down. I was going to the theater every night. By the time I was done, it was, you know, 12:30 or 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm bouncing off the walls in the middle of Chicago where nothing is open. And, you know, my then husband was sleeping. And don't marry a critic. Unless you marry another critic, which is what I did the second time. But, you know, and then you sleep late, and then you get up, and, you know, just the whole day is turned around. And I think that you sort of lose a sense of what the world is doing.
Well,
And I
it's
like
also-
it much better being.
You're the only critic was the only person required after a show was over to scream out his feelings about
Yes.
what he saw.
Yes.
Everybody goes home and sleeps on
Yes.
what
Right.
they saw.
Yeah.
So why would you?
Oh no,
Yeah.
usually
Yeah.
no.
No,
People
not
go-
everybody
people-
does that.
People
No,
run
no.
home,
They
phone
walk.
their
Go to
friends
dinner.
and say,
People
"Ah,
go to
say
dinner
that."
and have
No, they
people have
talk.
opinions walking out of
They
the
walk
theater.
out.
Yes, they
Having
walk
opinions
out.
is
Yeah.
one thing. Spreading the word is another.
But shouldn't you spread the word on the opinion as you've seen it? You've come out of the theater and you've heard the applause and the curtain has gone down and you're part of that, and then you write what you've seen. I think
You're
just
not
the
really
opposite.
part of that
Given
because-
all
because-
that time,
you're
you
never
then
gonna
say
win.
yes,
You
but
know,
on the other hand.
No, Isabel, you know, for one thing, you always presume. I mean, I was at a show the other night, and the audience was going crazy.
What, last night? Was it last
Well,
night?
it was the night before, but...
I've never seen...
Yes, exactly. But,
Well, what was
I mean,
the play?
You felt,
Come on.
you felt that no audience could be that moronic, so they had to be plants. I mean, but,
What they would do for a free pair of tickets.
Exactly. But,
Well, they're actors.
Yes, actors. You don't really take into account the audience. But I myself have always found, I don't know whether other people have found this on the panel, but I never really know what I think until I start to type it.
Yeah, right.
Or put it into a
Oh,
computer.
yes.
I never. That's why I will never say. It sounds very snooty, you know. People say, "Did you enjoy yourself, Mr. Barnes?" And I always freeze because I never. I don't really know whether I enjoy myself. I mean, it's one of those weird things.
There was a critic at the Tribune before I took over named William Leonard. Wonderful.
Yes,
You remember
yes,
Bill. He was also the saloon critic, the drama critic and saloon
Yes,
critic.
yes.
But Bill would say, I don't know, I haven't read my review yet.
Have
you
any
know-
of you ever walked out on a play during the intermission
And still reviewed it?
and still reviewed it?
No.
You can't.
Once only, long ago, and I regretted it, even though it was a really bad
Oh.
Charles Ludlam play.
Oh, I did once, but I wrote about it.
But I,
you
and
know,
I
yes,
always
yes.
say,
You laugh.
I would always
Yes,
say,
yes.
but I wouldn't do
Yes.
it.
But I've
what
never
ab-
done it
What
again.
about sleeping through a play?
Oh, yes.
That was a plant. I once saw you sleep through a review, through
Yes,
a play.
that I think is a legitimate form of criticism.
So the question is, how do you
popular one,
stay
I know.
awake? Do you have difficulty staying awake sometimes,
On
Charles?
occasion, after around the third hour of your standard
Crystal
loaded
Mix.
musical.
You do.
Yeah.
So what do you do?
Well,
Drink a lot
I-
of coffee? Or?
I find it helps not to eat before.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't probably help my fellow audience members when my stomach starts growling at the intermission, but it really does help. You know, caffeine is good. Caffeine is a worldwide.
Right.
you know.
I'm jolted.
do you do?
I'm jolted awake by the need for employment.
That helps. That helps.
Fear as motivating
Fear,
force.
fear.
Never underestimate fear as motivating force.
How much are you influenced by the environment? For instance, if it's very cold, or there's somebody coughing next to you, or there's a person with a hat in front of you, or you can't see the stage.
Not at all.
Not at all. You
I
can
don't think so.
eliminate
I mean,
everything.
I can review with toothache, you know, and I can disassociate. I have reviewed with toothache, but I mean, you really can dissociate.
I've been in situations where I was at a comedy that was less funny than Medea, and had a person behind me,
It was roaring.
one voice roaring from start to, from the moment from the lights went up, they thought that was funny, and it becomes so irritating. First of all, I'm convinced that the producers, got their brother-in-law to sit there and just said, "Laugh your ass off."
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Harvey knows that.
Harvey used to do that.
The only effect that has is infuriating you and making you really, really like an adversary of what's happening on stage. So
But
I
do
mean,
you-
it can
yeah.
affect you that
Do
way.
you never take into account the reaction in the audience? I do sometimes, when, particularly in something that's intended to be a straight comedy, which is the hardest thing in the world for me to review, that a play that has no subtext, that the entire objective is just to sort of amuse you, because that's not why I go to the theater. So I have to sort of imagine why someone would go to something like this. And when people around me seem to be having a really good time, and it doesn't feel like they're all the brother-in-law, that I have on occasion been known to say, everyone around me seemed to be having a really good time.
No, I've done
I
that.
wish I were there.
I find Wednesday matinees extraordinarily good audiences because they seem to be genuine audiences, and they, you know.
People with no jobs.
Exactly.
Paying attention.
Yes, but don't you have to take into effect the audience? Because from time to time I hear people say very apologetically, but I enjoyed it. I really did, as if to say I shouldn't have because the reviews were not good.
But you're not presumably, I'm not being paid, we're not being paid to reflect how you felt about what you saw.
No, we're not taking a Gallup
You're
poll.
useless, really, it's really a useless exercise if I'm just sort of taking, a sampling public opinion. Then you wouldn't need me, you'd need a meter, you'd need an applause meter, basically.
And
that's what we
particularly,
would decide.
when we go to see the shows, we know that there are a lot of plants in the audience. There are a lot of people getting free tickets, and they're encouraged to be very vocal about their reactions.
A review really should be the starting off point for a discussion. It shouldn't necessarily be the wall, the coming down on the production.
I do think though that people shouldn't take it too seriously. They shouldn't read a review and think, "Oh my God, I was wrong. I shouldn't have enjoyed that."
right.
But they do.
But they do.
Well, they shouldn't.
That's the thing is sometimes not all previews are packed with laughers because a lot of off-Broadway things you just go in their regular audiences, and the difference in an audience at a preview that yet hasn't been told yet what to think, and the audience the day after the reviews come out can be really depressing. That a lot of people might have really enjoyed it and then are told they're not supposed to.
Well, I think that when people are going out for a night's entertainment, they have made a sort of investment. They've made an investment of money, they've made an investment of time, and consequently they have a prior commitment to enjoy themselves, which the critic doesn't necessarily have. I mean, most people, after they've struggled to get into Les Mis or something, or Cats or something like that, they're not going to say, "Oh, that was awful," because in a way it's a judgment on their judgment. It's a judgment, it's like, buying a wrong stock on Wall Street.
Marrying the wrong person. Gee, I just wasted 10 years of my life.
Rome has been trying to get a word in here.
No, I mean, a lot of things are going through my mind, but, one thing that, in response to this whole notion of, does the audience affect what you say or write, I remember one day, one of the first shows I had to review was My One and Only. Do you remember, with Twiggy and Tommy Tune in it? And I really wasn't sure what to make of it, and I was getting kind of anxious because, this was one of my first reviews, and I wanted it to make it real good, and I was thinking very hard about how to do this. And I remember there was a woman behind me who just kind of chuckled, and she said, "What a cockamamie show this is." And that loosened up the whole creative process, and I realized, that it really was a cockamamie show, and that's okay. And, oftentimes I think we could be accused of intellectual snobbery. I think one of the faults that we suffer from is that we apply the same standard, I think, oftentimes to
What we white man?
many we.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll keep the we. Not I. We. That was on purpose.
Okay.
But we all do this, I think. We overanalyze a show perhaps unnecessarily. And I was thinking, for example, Footloose. It's a show that is not very good by the standards that you would judge an Amadeus, for example. But there is merit to it when we have a segment on we do a theater show at New York One called Seen and Heard. And we just take a camera and we go in front of the theater as they're letting the audience out, and we ask people, "What do you think?" Well, in about 90% of the people who we spoke with, and obviously this is an unscientific sampling or poll, but 90% of the people said, "I just thought this was the greatest thing I've ever seen." Now, the interesting thing is we also discovered it was the only show they had ever seen. But that being said, that show was designed for those particular people. So is it fair for us to slam a show?
Yes, it is totally fair, because we are expected to give an informed opinion. I mean, if we say, exactly, I mean, if we say, "This is the best Hamlet I've ever seen," if it's the first Hamlet I've ever seen, it's also the worst Hamlet I've ever seen. So, I mean...
But it's a good play.
It's a good play.
Well, but that we have to try.
I think we've got to accept that we can't accept an objective opinion, but we can expect from the critic an informed opinion, an opinion which is based on many years of you know, plush sitting, and you know, many years of, you know, I don't know, preparation each time. But I mean,
Sitting in the dark.
Let me
God.
There is an elitism that's built into this. There's no doubt about it. I mean, when we write a review of King Lear, we don't start by saying, you know, this is the story of a father who. You know, I mean, you presume that the audience.
That's what it's about.
You presume that there's a certain level at which you're all sort of arguing, and you're going to lose, you know, people at both ends probably, the hyper-informed and the completely, you know, ignorant. But that's, I think that's the worst possible way to think that, you know, well, you know, this is meant for some
Be
people.
good enough for you review.
That's right. That's right.
And then there's no
you
level,
idiots
there's no,
will like
you have
it.
no,
Good enough for you.
Yeah.
You have
Well,
no benchmark. You have nothing to from which you
But
feel.
let me just take that one step further. In my review, for example, of Footloose, I went back, I was looking through some old reviews, and what I had said was, it's not a very good show. But if you enjoyed Grease, for example, if this is your cup of tea, if this is the kind of thing that you like, then this will be for you. But I think we have to put a caveat there somewhere explaining that it's not for those who love classical theater by any means, by any stretch of the imagination.
But if you
I think that's a very
approach,
good point.
but if you approach everything the same way, and I think we must, which is basically ask yourself 3 questions: what were they trying to do?
Yes.
How well did they do it? Was it worth doing?
Right.
If you can give it the benefit of the doubt and try to figure out what they were trying to do, judge it within its context and its ambition, and then you still have the chance to say, but this is, you know, I think this is garbage. So if you answer those 3 questions with anything, then I think that you end up not applying standards that are inappropriate.
But see, the difference for me is if I think something is garbage, and yet it succeeded in fulfilling all of these
yes,
goals,
yes.
then it's a good play, because it did what it intended to do. It fulfilled its purpose in life.
But was
so
that
does the
purpose
Jerry
worth
Sanders.
doing?
One of the difficulties is that if you start by saying or writing whatever, if you start by saying, well, this is pretty awful, but you idiots out there will like it. You know, the people out there don't say, well, I'm an idiot. Oh, I'm going to like that. or if you're much more likely to turn to the guy next door who cleaned his car and saying, here, Charlie, there's really a play for you out there. But, I mean, you know, I think it's there. I honestly think you can. I agree. You know, the you know, famous, you know, famous Schiller 3 points and all that, whatever they try to do and all that. I agree with all that. It does work.
It does work.
You have to be very careful about trying to imply to people, well, I didn't like it, but you might, because it gives that
condescending.
very condescending. Yeah.
Condescending.
But I think
But we all have guilty
that-
pleasures, you know.
Well, there is that, and also I think you can convey part of what our job is being a reporter, conveying the experience of seeing the show, even if you don't necessarily love the show. And so that people, when they read your reviews, even though you are going to, of course, you know, indicate your problems with it, sometimes if you describe it well enough, you know, they're going to know that, you know, whatever this critic thinks, I think I'm going to like this show. And of course, also there's the factor that people who read you often are going to be able to gauge your tastes,
Absolutely.
likes, and dislikes,
Absolutely.
and you know, judge accordingly.
You can't read a critic once. You know, you have to, for good or ill. I mean, I've often had people come to me and say, I will always know when I'm going to like a show because you'll hate it. Right. And you know, this I think is a legitimate way of reading critics.
Absolutely.
Do you
I
ever
certainly get to know people's blind spots.
Yes.
you know.
Do you ever cut a play some slack? Say, well, it was well-intentioned, or the group had handicaps and they were performing, you know, and so I won't use the same standard that I might use.
Well, there is the issue of you know, your own limitations and biases and all the things you come to a play with based on your own experience. You know, when I walk into a play written by a women about women, I think one of the problems with the theater today is that too many plays are written from niches where they can't go beyond the group they're writing specifically.
That's right.
for.
Since most plays are written by men for men, then occasionally every one in
rarely-
25.
I rarely come across one, but you do try to some degree to open yourself, which is the whole point of the theater. You know, you try to, you know, you make
See
some
another viewpoint.
allowances.
Yeah,
What if you know somebody in a play?
I don't.
You never
I try
meet
so
actors or
hard not
actresses.
to. I really try.
Clive,
not
you know
to.
lots of people in the theater. What happens when it's one of your dearest friends?
I always found out very early on that in this business you had to be able to cut the throat of your grandmother. And
you have.
I have.
No, that was my grandmother.
Anybody else cut the throat of?
I find
Drag
that
the
there's
throat.
something called emotional conflicts of interest, which I think
Yes.
are much more dangerous than
Oh.
whether or not some producer takes you to lunch.
Yeah,
You know,
but
that if I
like them.
you like them, or also in not really in New York that much, but in the rest of the country, you know, because I did, you know, I worked in America first before I came to New York. And there, most critics are also required to do interviews and, you know, and do the feature stories about the shows that they're about to review. And I found that it was very difficult. I found that if I began to picture their little faces above the keyboard,
Yes.
that I was in trouble. And it didn't mean that I would be nicer to them. Sometimes I might be harsher on them just to prove to myself I'm
you're
not
not,
being nice to
right.
them.
But there is a
Which is
reaction.
why I decided, I mean, when I was in Chicago, it was in the 70s, and David Mamet's first play was the first new play I ever reviewed, and I sort of grew up in the same neighborhood with all the Steppenwolf people, and you know, these are the people I had the most in common with, and they were the most fun, and I wanted to be with them, but I knew that no matter how much they would say, it's okay, we're all professionals, when it came down to my doing what I have to do, which is totally unnatural in regular society, that it became strained. And because you're basically attacking not only their vanity, but their ability to
Live.
pay to live, and whether or not their parents are embarrassed, or that it was good that their father worked 3 jobs so they could go to dancing school. There's too much at stake. So I try really hard to. Some people can have friends and write about them. I can't do it. Maybe it has to do with being female. Do you know?
What's it
Do
like?
critics still get criticism from larger-than-life people like Joe Papp and David Merrick?
Not so much, I don't think, although, you know, occasionally. But Joe Papp and David Merrick were rather special cases, weren't they? they really did a sort of... but I don't know. What do other people think? I don't think...
Well, you know, with the advent of email, I get a lot of reaction. And it goes both ways. But people feel it's a lot easier, you know, to just tap on the computer and tell me how they really feel.
I get some. You get some very nasty mail from actors.
How does it
Oh,
feel
yes,
to be
right.
hated?
Well, you know, it's not. I find for the most part, you know, maybe I'm deluding myself, but for the most part, the conversation when it happens is carried on fairly genially. I mean, I've never had a pitcher of water dumped on my head or anything like that. But you hear from. In fact, one day I got a letter from an actor. I wasn't even. He out of the blue, I got a letter from an actor who basically took issue. It just reduced me to almost tears in this letter, just, you know, horrible letter. And then I realized I was seeing him in a play that night.
Was it a preemptive
He confessed to the press agent of the show that he had written this letter.
That's called hot stuff.
And the press agent called me, like, in a panic, and, you know, said, please don't take anything he says. He's a crazy person. And literally, I think if they would have fired him. I mean, they would have said, look, he's out of the, they've written him out. You know?
Oh, my God.
And I remember, like, having this weird experience of sitting there watching him and knowing, you know, it was a completely compromised situation.
So how did you review him?
I mentioned him in a most way, and I said, and the part of the father. Because I couldn't bring myself either to, you know, I certainly wasn't going to attack him, but I certainly, you know, I mean, it was.
How was he?
It was terrible.
Skewered him.
Well, then it was very
I once had a series of death threats. I mean, serious death threats. Oh, yeah. And this was written by someone extremely distinguished. It was a choreographer, actually.
I know who.
Yes, you know who. I'm sure. And he was very distinguished. And he
Still
was
is.
Still is. And he was absolutely mad. And he sent myself and Anna Kisselgoff, my colleague on the Times, dance critic of the Times, he sent us little coffins, little kind of things. I know where you live. Well, obviously he knew where we lived, and all sorts of little kind of drawings. And in the end, we found ourselves talking to his psychiatrist, and it was, you know, and the psychiatrist told me, I don't think he's really serious. But wouldn't you say that people, you know, can go over the edge? He said, well, they can, but they don't usually.
And the fact is that everyone's always very nice to this choreographer. He's a wonderful, right? I mean, I don't think, I get a certain, you know, percentage of die, Jew, bitch, fag, hag letters. You know, there's a whole category of, you know. And when I was at the Chicago Tribune, which for many years had been a very, well, it was far-right newspaper in the old days. I mean, in my shtetl, they didn't, you know, no one read it. And when I got there, there was a lot of anti-Semitic mail that would come, you know, and there was, my favorite was that Linda Weiner should be dekiked. So I thought, you know, it would be nice one day if they just ran my picture and said, Linda Weiner is being dekiked. Her column will reappear under the name of Linda Christian.
But you don't get criticism over your hair. Now, I bet you do. Because I used to get so many letters, forget what I was saying, it was, I hate your hair. That you've ruined yourself. One letter was, your hair is a disgrace to your mother's memory.
Wow.
I want to go all the way back to something that Peter said when he said, that isn't what I was hired for. That isn't what I was getting paid for as a critic. And I want to know what it was that you were getting paid for.
Is that a criticism?
No, not at all.
What it is I'm getting paid for is... I mean,
what is a critic? What is the role of a critic? You're hired to be
I think partially to, I mean, first and foremost to be clear about what you think, express it in an entertaining way. I think that that's an underrated quality in maybe different than it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when there was this notion of received opinion from a few outlets that, and you could afford to be kind of a little stuffier, maybe. Not present company, of course, accepted. But I think that the value of a critic today is as much being able to reach people and make them feel something for this art form that, you know, to many people is a more remote thing than it was a generation ago.
Yes, absolutely. I think readability is extraordinarily important because the unread critic is a non-critic.
Right.
And I think readability is very, very important.
And if you take something that's fascinating for 500 people and make it boring for 500,000 people, then it's a crime against the art.
Exactly. I remember Sohiro once telling me that the job of critics was the job of a critic was to sell tickets.
Oh, this is
and I said, so you're absolutely right. The only thing is that we get to choose the tickets we want to sell, and I think but I think that the enthusiasm of a critic is extremely important. He must. I mean, no one ever writes a play with the idea of it being seen by someone who's already seen 50 plays that week. I mean, you know, the critic is an unusual kind of person. And the first thing he's got to do is to have an enormous love and enthusiasm for the theatre. It's an unnatural life that we lead. And, you know, most people would go mad having to do it. Some of us do. But I mean, in fact, you know, you have to have. There's nothing worse than the critic who is bored with his job, but can't think of anything else to do, and he drags himself to the theatre or the concert hall. More often, it seems to be happening more often to music critics than anyone else.
Well, that's because they have to listen to the same 50 pieces over and over again.
Exactly. But you know, it really is you do have to have enthusiasm and a great love for what you're doing.
Yeah, and the hardest part is bringing that enthusiasm into your writing, because critical writing I think some people think it's sort of formulaic, you know, where the costume's good, where the set's good, where the performance is good. And there is a certain element of that. You always have to touch certain bases. And the hard part is avoiding falling into the usual traps and being excited every time you sit down to write about a new show.
And in a weird way, it's collaborative. This is the only way in which it's collaborative with the playwright and the actor, because you can't write any better than the play itself. I mean,
No,
very
you
often.
can't. No, you can't.
You're somehow moved or inspired or brought to certain, obviously certain issues that a playwright's raising that you connect with. But all those things, you know, can elevate your writing. You know, the idea of the 17th time you're seeing something about a dysfunctional family in you know in a hovel in you know, and you've read this and there's nothing new in the project. Makes it very, very hard to bring some life to the...
But if you write a boring review, I mean, if you write a boring review, they don't say, oh, Peter Marks wrote about a boring play.
Right.
This is a boring review about a boring play. They'll say, Peter Marks wrote a boring review. You know, so the danger is making things sound more interesting
because that's the energy you're bringing.
Because a good critic
to
me is a person with interesting opinions. A good critic, it doesn't matter if I agree or not agree, but it has an interesting mind and talks about the art in a way that makes me see something else. And sometimes the danger, I think, in some cases, is that you know the person who's writing is much more interesting than the person than the thing they're writing about, and pretty soon that thing starts to sound like you know maybe a little bit more interesting.
But I think that this issue of style, everyone has to have a personal style, and you know, we all try to. But I think you write differently about a comedy than you would about a tragedy. I think the style of the notice should reflect the nature of the piece that you're writing about. You know, the nature of the play or musical or whatever that you're writing about. I think that as well as things.
But Peter did touch on that. It does, you know, if you've seen something that is just extremely profound, it elevates the writing. I find my writing matches what I've seen. In the same way, you know, you go to see a movie and you come out and you kind of, you're living off the fumes of the mood that film has set in the same way that a good play can do to you.
But don't you think that the positive reviews and the negative reviews are the easy ones to write?
Yes.
Yes, oh, of course.
You know, it's the stuff in between. It's the stuff in between, which is what most of life is. And most of our experience is the yes buts and the no buts.
Why is there more wit in a pan than in a rave?
Yeah, they're so much easier.
They're much easier to write, and it's much easier to be nasty than to be nice. I mean,
witty nice is hard.
Witty nice is hard. I mean, but what I always feel that critics shouldn't do, and I've always tried to avoid it, is by picking out jokes out of the writer and putting them into. I mean, one of my very distinguished colleagues, who's gone now, but he used to make his reviews very funny, but half of the jokes had been stolen from Neil Simon or whoever, you know. And
he was the Milton Berle of critics.
Exactly, he was.
That's writing about comedians is like that. When you can always, you know how hard it must be for people who regularly cover comedians, because you really can't. It's such a...
You can't tell their jokes.
The temptation to tell their jokes and look funny, you know.
Right.
And they don't translate.
No,
they don't.
not well.
In print, or at least not out of my mouth.
Well, they say that a critic is a person who gets his or her education in public. Have any of you made a mistake, Roma?
Made a mistake? You mean...
made a mistake.
Never, I never made a mistake.
Have you ever made a mistake?
All the time. I mean, sometimes I get names wrong. I mean, only this last Sunday I got a name wrong. Some actress I called Thomas, whose name was Thorne, and I've had to put an apology in, trying desperately to wonder whether I can make a joke about Thorne at you know, a road, then decided not against it. But I mean, it's very...
on deadline at the Tribune, the danger of the overnights. I was reviewing The Elephant Man, and my first sentence was, David Merrick, the hideously deformed His name was John Merrick.
But it could have been David.
My worst one, or one of my many, was that in television you have to pronounce their names.
Oh, yeah.
So you always, you get back to the station and you find this name, and I had never heard of Ralph Fiennes before.
right.
And when I called him Ralph Fiennes because I was just trying to sound it out. And oh, did I get letters, you idiot.
I still
Ever
call
made
him
a
Ralph
mistake?
Fiennes very quickly.
Ever made a mistake, Peter?
I wouldn't admit to it, but no. I've had regrets. I mean, I think I would go back, and there was probably a performance I was a little bit hard on, or you try not to review badly dogs and children ever. I mean, that's sort of a standard. But I mean, I was pretty hard on the production of Annie. It was very early in the. I feel.
You
I mean,
were
I
tough
don't
on
think it
the
was good
dog?
production, but what?
You were tough on the dog?
He was the best part.
It was Annie you were bad.
Before I owned one, I didn't understand the whole thing. But I probably. I mean, I don't regret having panned it. I wonder if it was a little,
Has anyone ever corrected, like seen it again later on and said, "Oh, I was wrong about this before"?
I
You
have
must.
often.
You've had the
Yes,
opportunity
I
to.
have.
Sure.
But
Yeah, exactly.
I find that sometimes that I always remember one. This was very much in overnight reviews because you would do very quickly and you would think something would strike you as funny at the time and it would gone. And I remember one particular instance when I woke up and I said, someone, and he was very, very, he had a very small part. And I said, so-and-so made the least of a small part. And it struck me as funny at the time. And then I read it in the morning.
Still funny.
And I suddenly had the image of this man sitting at his breakfast table with his family. And made the least of a small part.
You do realize that Peter and I are going to use that tomorrow.
I gotta go. I gotta go.
Obviously, you're all very knowledgeable, and that's the reason why you are where you are and here. But how important is it to bring that knowledge in? If you had seen Frederick March, as I had in the part, then you would have realized John Jones, and that. Most people had not seen Frederick March, or whoever that you're talking about in the years of reviewing the two. Is that a fair thing to use as a reviewer?
I myself, from my enormous age, I mean, I have seen Frederick March.
I can go further.
I think I can. But anyway, I started to go to theatre in 1936, so that's fairly. But I find probably it's something which I probably ought to curb, but I do find myself comparing, if for a Long Day's Night, yes, I possibly would compare. I think that in a way it's a useful function of criticism to show that that there's a backlog of classic performance, and also to show that not that everyone should have seen someone else. I mean, I remember when I was a kid. Flagstead was the reigning Wagnerian soprano, and everyone said, "Oh, but you should have seen Frida Leder." But then I found that soon, I was able to say, but you should have seen Flagstead. But in fact, I think that for a critic to have a background is useful. I don't think anyone should really start writing criticism until they've been going to the theatre for at least 10 years. I really don't think that, that people should, just sort of, because you've got to have some kind. Well, one thing, it gives you confidence, doesn't it?
You can't review. I really do believe it's very hard to review Brian Dennehy in a classic American play without knowing, about Lee J. Cobb and Dustin Hoffman.
Exactly.
Yes, but don't you hate it reading reviews where people pretend that they'd seen people they haven't?
Well, when they're 40 years old and they say they saw Frederick March.
40 years ago. I started out
Yes.
very young and reviewing classical music. And so, I would go to Chicago Symphony and realize that everybody there practically had heard the Mahler 10th a lot more frequently than I had. And all I could do was do as much of my homework and try to have a context within what I could know. But I decided early on I was never going to pretend I'd been somewhere I hadn't or that I knew something I didn't. And I think, you know, if you just start there, and then, you know, the more you see, the easier it is to do that.
I think you
I've
really...
done, sorry.
That's all right. I just was going to say, I think you have to moderate those references, because I hate it when I read reviews and all of it is history.
Well, that's
and they're giving you the background of a play, you know, and particularly if it's a play that, you know, has some
It's balanced,
has some age and depth. It's very difficult.
You want to say something, John?
Well, I'm feeling very inferior here, not having, you know, very many years of experience. But of course, you have to start somewhere. And of course, I had been going to the theater and loving all art forms, you know, for many years before I started writing. But and I think there is an age at which your critical tastes are sort of formed.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I know I liked some pretty ghastly things at age 15 that I would not admit to now, like Ayn Rand novels, for instance. But and
You were the one.
and I, you know, certainly I wish when I'm sitting down to write a review of a classic play that I'd seen, you know, 10 productions instead of 2. But
Well, that Fountainhead musical is going to do very well.
Do you read the play before you go to see it?
well, yes, you know, as Linda said, you know, you have to do your homework
read
if
it.
you're starting from, you know, a lower point than your
But do you read new plays?
No, that's I
And do you
think-
read a
don't
new
read
play
new
that was, I'm sorry, am I butting in? Do you read a play like that's already been in London, that's already in script, it's done, but
No.
that maybe your your colleagues had read it and you had seen it in London and you hadn't, or something like that?
No, I don't. I mean, I sort of, my rule is if it's, you know, if it's considered a classic, if it's a revival, basically, I will always try to read it before, and usually not the night before, because that obviously is going to, you know, change your opinion. So, but for new plays, I don't do that. Do you? I'm
I
curious.
find it useful. I do it less and less now, but through the years, as I was getting, you know, as I was getting increasingly less frightened, I developed this one-acting a play, where I would read the first act of a play that's in the repertory, but that I don't know. And I'd read the first act so that I have some idea of what the playwright's intentions were as opposed to what the director's intentions are. But then I'd leave the second act so that I could be part of the audience and still have a sense of surprise.
That's interesting. Do you do that?
Do
Is
you,
that a
Roma,
common
do
thing?
you read the plays before you see them?
Occasionally, if it's a Greek tragedy, I try to get caught up, because I just have an aversion to Greek tragedy. I have to admit that. And that doesn't mean I'll pan it. You know, I mean, it's my personal thing, and that I try to keep that out of the reviews. But occasionally, I need that, you know, that summary, even if it's Cliff Notes. I need to go back and remember what it's all about. But you know, there's a new phenomenon that I just love, and that is a lot of new plays. The press agents are supplying the scripts, so I get such a kick out of reading, you know, the text, even after I've seen it, to see, you know, what a director has done to it and how you know, a particular actor has read a line. I love that.
Yeah, it's very useful now.
Yes.
Having
And also, there's so many Irish ones that you can't understand the brogue. So this is very helpful.
That's right.
I like to to read a play before I see it, actually, but I don't read it. I kind of skim it. I like to know that Hamlet died in the end, and I sort of, so I don't get surprised, which is perhaps wrong. But I'm not a good visualizer. If I were a good visualizer, I'd probably be a producer and make money. Not that many producers do make money, but still, you know what I mean. But in fact, I do like to have a look at a play before, but I skim it rather than read it seriously.
And you, Peter?
I just like to find the right theater. I mean,
as long as you're in the
after
right
that,
direction.
no, I mean, in the season, I try and read as much as I can. You do find yourself, though, backing up sometimes. You know, you're sometimes going out 5 nights a week, and you know, you're writing, and so there are gaps. I don't have a hard and fast rule, but I try to.
Peter, talking of that, have you ever not found the right theatre? Because I have. I once couldn't find a theatre, and in the end I had to ring up and say they were holding the curtain as well, and it was the most embarrassing moment of my life. But has anyone else ever not found a theatre? I did this with a loft.
I've gone to the wrong theater.
You've gone to the wrong theatre.
You know,
I have to look before I leave every time.
Yeah, so do I. And you look at the, look
where
at
is
the,
it?
and look at the back of the theatre index to find
Yeah.
out where it is. Yes, so do I. And you know the funny thing is, I know.
confession.
I know
Just like
where
wind us up and send us
running
off.
all over.
The funny thing is, I know where every London theatre is, but I don't know where any New York theatres are. which is, I don't know.
Isn't that
kind of
odd
you know, growing up, you're
Yeah.
more receptive. It's
No,
like
those nerve pathways were a lot stronger.
exactly. It's like my children know the New York subway, but I've never found. I never can use the New York subway, but I can use the Underground and the Paris Metro. I don't know why, but I can only use the 1 and 3 lines. You know, the 2 and 3. After that, I'm lost.
Today's critics feel that their influence is diminished. After all, critics have tried very hard to stamp out Andrew Lloyd Webber and have failed. They have a new target in Frank Wildhorn.
He won't go away, really.
He won't go away. With a name like that, how could he?
How do you feel about theaters? Do you
What?
prefer one theater over another, or do you say, oh, Lord, it's in X theater again. I dislike that theater so much. I don't like the sight lines. I don't like the thing. Do you ever, does that
Don't think it
come into
really
it?
affects things very much. You know, it's like some theatres have reputations for flops, but put a hit in it and it's gone. No, I don't think that. You know, I mean, obviously we like some theatres more than others.
Yeah.
Who doesn't? But I don't think that really
Colors.
I
no.
have a slightly different perspective. I'm the second string off-Broadway critic for the Times, and I'm just happy when the theater has a bathroom.
Yes,
You know, I've seen many plays.
You mean some of them do?
Yeah, I mean, where, you know,
But
it's
usually you
you're
have to wait till the play's over because you have to walk
You walk
across
over the
You
stage.
know, I'm in a theater where you have to bus your own tray, basically.
Yeah.
You know, there's like you clean out an area in front of you.
We
so,
always
you know,
sit down.
you know, it's a little different for me.
But I do think that there's theaters, especially in off-Broadway theaters, where there's places I like to go because I've had good times there. And it's not, and chances are when I go tonight, there will be something good there and I can start to change my opinion. But, you know, if you start to constantly associate a place with some place that, you know, that things where you've had bad times, they start to just seem dreary to you, and it's hard to drag myself there. And also, you know, who wouldn't prefer to sit in the Lyceum or the, you know, instead of the Minskoff?
Right.
Anybody? You know, I mean, there are
Presumably Minskoff.
yeah. You know, there are some theaters that are barns, and some of them just make you feel embraced by them.
And yet all of them seem to have 2 small seats for somebody who's 6'2".
Oh, yeah.
They're getting smaller, aren't they?
Yeah,
Seems that way.
Doesn't it seem that way?
But also
getting
men think
colder,
that they get both arms. Did you never notice that? Men always think they have 2 arms on their seats. They don't. Everyone has 1 arm. And
which is
the
it?
other arm
Yes,
belongs
yes,
to
which
the
one is
person
it?
next to you,
But which
the
one
woman
is
next
it?
to you.
Which one is it?
What?
The right arm or
It
the left?
depends on which way you're coming from.
I see.
You
I
see,
see.
but it's best
perhaps someone
not. It's
doesn't-
best not to do this, guys.
Yes.
This is not.
Yes.
This is not your
Yes.
seat.
Yes.
Yes.
Now, here's a technical question. Do you use pens that light up in the dark? Anybody ever use that?
I once
Or do you
tried
write?
it. A press agent once gave me one, as a ballet press agent, once gave me one as a little gift. And I thought, oh, how wonderful. And so because I can never read my notes. I mean, never, ever. I mean,
This is the technical problem.
But I sometimes take them because people know who critics are, and they look at you, and if you don't take notes, it looks as though you're not really very serious.
Or you're falling
So-
asleep.
Or you're falling asleep. So anyway, and sometimes it stops you from falling asleep.
That's right.
But anyway, on this occasion, I pulled out this pen, and I put on the light, and the entire audience, searchlight. I never did it again.
But people are always giving you those as
They
presents.
always-
They
don't
think
they?
it's such a good idea.
I know,
I'll
I've-
give that critic a pen with a light.
Has the light.
I mean, why not wear one of those minor hats?
And they make a noise. The other thing is when you click it on in a silent scene, it makes it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So,
But how
Harvey,
about note-taking?
You've
Do-
been
Yes,
very
can people
quiet
read their
about this.
notes?
As a press agent, how have you worked with the reviewers? What is your role? What is the role of the press agent with the theater critic?
Just to make sure that they get their tickets.
They know the theater.
And get to the right theater.
It's been my experience, and I've had an awful lot of experience, that basically the critics are rarely, if ever, wrong. You may be able to beat them through what is now called marketing. In my day, it meant going to the A&P. Now it means something else. But basically, on the quality of the show, they are rarely, if ever, wrong. And I don't
Well,
think
who's
that...
the they? I mean, sometimes you've got 5 critics with 5 different, totally different opinions.
No, you don't
which
very
one?
often.
Very
You
often.
don't very often. No, you have
Consensus.
usually a very strong consensus, I
Yeah,
find.
well, I guess it's just I'm usually
Well, out there. Wrong again, wrong again, wrong again, Wanda. There you are.
There was a whole season there that I labeled "The Cheese Stands Alone."
Does that mean then that we should have more than one critic on a paper so that you can say, look at the 2 different opinions on it?
Wasn't that the purpose of the Sunday paper? Is Sunday at the New York Times? Wasn't that why it started?
I don't know what the real reason was.
Here,
I don't.
Harvey will
I
know.
suspect it wasn't. But
Harvey will know.
I think. Well, Mr. Barnes.
Oh,
will
and
know.
Mr. Barnes will know. But that predated Barnes, though, right?
No.
No?
No.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't really know. Or, you know, it's no comment. But, but I think that the difficulty of 2 writers on the paper, this was always taken up by the Times for a long time, at one period, you know, many years ago. And because it was the Times, they wanted to have 2 critics. They didn't give a damn whether the Daily News or the New York Post had 2 critics. They always wanted 2 critics on the Times. But in the end, in the first place, if you have 2 drama critics, why shouldn't you have 2 opera critics, 2 dance critics, 2 whatever? You know, that's one thing. The second thing is that first, a lot of any review is partly telling the story, setting the scene. So, I mean, who is going... so each review would be rather similar in some respects. Then, so, you know, you would have to say, okay, Charlie, I told the story last night, you would tell it this night, you know, okay. The other difficulty is that if the Times gave 2 raves, that would be terrific, but, you know, if it gave 2 pans, that would be certain death, even worse than 1 pan. And if it gave 1 rave and 1 pan, then,
but
you know...
But then you'd be choosing, the reader would know that that's the one that I really respect and I follow, and his taste or her taste are the same as mine.
But I don't think that in that case, I mean, I think possibly what would happen is that one critic would eventually sort of outshadow the other critic, rightly or wrongly. I mean, I'm not saying that, but I think that one critic would become popular, one critic would not, you know, and I mean, I think that I don't think there's any really good reason to have two reviews in.
I don't either. I mean, there's how many outlets? I mean, review. I mean, the variety is in the variety of publications.
Yes, exactly.
I
I
think
think it makes sense at the Times.
Can you hold it?
Yeah,
Because
sorry.
we have to take a break now.
right.
And all these wonderfully wise words will be said when we come back again. And so for us and for the audience, just hold it for 1 second and stand up and take a break, walk around, take a deep breath, and come right back again. And we'll continue the American Theatre Wing seminar on working in the theatre. Thank you.
This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Welcome back to the American Theatre Wing seminar on working in the theatre. Before we return to our knowledgeable panel, I would like to point out that the Wing is more than a sponsor of seminars, more than our acclaimed Tony Awards given for excellence in the theatre, which we present in partnership with the League of American Theatres and Producers on television. Ours is an organization whose year-round programs are dedicated to serving the theater and the community. We have created audience development programs for students like Introduction to Broadway, which began 8 years ago and has enabled 75,000 New York City high school students to attend a Broadway show, many for the very first time. And through our Theater in Schools program, theater professionals go into classrooms to discuss the craft of theater with the students. And in addition, we have our hospital program, which dates back to World War I. Today's version of the program uses talent from Broadway, off-Broadway, and the cabaret world to entertain patients in nursing homes, veterans hospitals, children's wards, and AIDS centers, bringing that magic of theater to those who cannot get to the theater themselves. We are proud of the work we do and very happy for the important working relationship we have with the theater community, and so very grateful to everyone who makes our work possible. Now, let's get back to our seminar on critics. And I'd like to start part 2 with a question for the panel. And my question is, do you ever go back and review a show? Do you go back to see whether it lives either up to your expectations, or if you gave it a bad review and it's still running, why it is still running? So Harvey, Pia, would you like to take that up?
Anybody go back?
Well,
Revisit?
We have to go back a lot when there's cast changes. So, you know, if there's one cast change or 2 cast changes, you do get to look at the show again. And then when I like something, I go back a lot. I become quite a fanatic because, and my husband, who's a music critic, thinks I'm insane, but I say, look, you're going to be able to see Madame Butterfly again next year and 5 years from now. If I don't see Sunday in the Park with George as many times as I possibly can right now, chances are, you know, I will never see it again. Or if I do, it will change 10 years from now, and I will have changed 10 years from now, and it won't be those actors. So the only way to really get these shows into your bloodstream is by seeing them over and over again. So I go back a lot.
Occasionally I'll go, usually critics, as many people may not know, are invited by shows to review their shows, and we go on nights designated as critics' previews. Once a show is running, sometimes we go back without alerting the production. I've done this on several occasions with the long-running musicals on Broadway, Cats, Phantom, Miss Saigon, and did a wrap-up piece once where I sat in the audience of Cats and watched as the scenery started peeling off the back of the. It was so old, the production. I put in I think in the review I said something like, you know, someone call the super, because they got wrong. But we do go back a lot. I mean, you know, there's just as the theater is not a one-night deal. It goes on and on. We sort of serve it. We maintain it ourselves on that kind of basis.
Actually, I have a question for Harvey. As a press agent, were you ever in a position to warn your company that a critic was coming? I mean, was there ever an issue where you said, you know, look alive, folks, because we've got so and so is coming in the audience? Or
well, in my time as a press agent, which ended 26 years ago, we had fixed opening nights, and all the critics came. So the cast knew what to expect, and they either faced it or they crumbled. It could go either way.
I just wondered if
However,
we go back.
Really, in the long run, it didn't influence the critics that much. I mean, yes, I've seen plays where the night before the opening, the performance was so bad that the audience walked out, and the next night it was absolutely marvelous. I remember a play called Any Wednesday with Sandy Dennis. It got rave notices and ran a long time. But that was a rarity.
But what about when somebody, say Peter's going to go back to see Phantom of the Opera? Do you let the company know that the Times is in the house, you know, later in the run?
My tendency would be not to let them know at any time. I mean, they're there to do a job. They should be doing that job to the best of their ability on any night, whether there's a critic there or not. Nothing changes. What's important to them should be the audience, people they're working to.
Did you ever hate any critics and say, I'm going to give them a bad seat and I don't like those people, and
middle of the row.
Purposely seat her in a bad spot?
I once worked for a producer who despised all critics. And he knew that I had a friend who was a coach of the New York Knickerbockers, and he asked me to invite the team to the opening night and to seat them in front of the critic.
Classic. That's classic.
You asked a very good question before about
the diminishing influence of critics, which I suspect, as an observer now, I suspect has been happening over the years, because shows that are roundly panned can run 5, 10 years. And even, you know, awful flops that used to close on Saturday night, if they opened on Thursday, are running week in and week out. Do you sense any diminishing influence?
I think for sure. I think that as the theater was slow to pick up on the marketing techniques that the rest of the country and the world, the West, had been perfecting for better or usually worse. And in one way, I think it's healthy, because it's nice to have a show not be affected necessarily by whether or not the Times, and we say the Times because really the Times is the one that can keep a show open or close a show. Right. The rest of us, as much as we may be brilliant people, but we're wonderful papers, it really, the Times is the one that historically would be the one that was blamed for closing shows or praised for keeping shows open. And now the problem is, so that's a good thing in that way. It's healthy that one person or two people are not deciding the taste of the entire community. On the other hand, then, a lot of the shows that continue to run on the basis of the size of their advertising budget, so that if you've got enough money to make a show review proof, then you can run a pretty long time on the unsuspecting.
I'm thrilled with that, though,
yeah,
as you say, because I used to be on the other end of things. I was an actress when I started out in the theater business, and so I was getting, I was on the bad end of a lot of those bad reviews, and I would resent, and I would resent the power of critics, and I never got beyond off-Broadway, but I remember reading about friends' plays, and I used to just curse whoever was writing those reviews at the time, who would have the power to close a show, and usually it was at the Times, but it would be almost a conspiracy. Everybody would join in, and you're right, the reviews are not all that different. There's not that much of a distinction between the critics. And I hated that. So I'm so happy that shows can survive even with that.
But it's a little of an overstatement that I do think that the Times, really had the power to close shows. I think that, it could deprive it of an audience to a certain degree. There are numerous examples down the years of shows that the Times loved that did not find an audience, and conversely, shows that the Times hated that stayed even before the age of the deep pockets. My defensive posture at this point is, if I can dissuade one person from seeing a bad show, I've done my job. That's what you sort of feel sometimes. But on the whole, it's not a great. It's a burden to feel that on the back of your opinion, employment is going to be received or denied by people. And so in that sense, it frees you up. It liberates you somewhat from that feeling that you're out there doing a job of selling tickets, which is really a critic doesn't want to do.
Do you ever feel, though, that burden influences what you say or how you say it? If you really hate something so much and know that there might be an audience out there for it, do you temper the review at all?
Well, I know what I do. I know that when I dislike something very much, and this goes to Harvey's profession, there's a tremendous adversarial relationship that develops in the crafting of what you say in a review. I have had my words. Your words in your review don't live as long as the quotes that appear over the ads that run in the ABCs every day in the New York Times and on the marquees. I've had, and we all have these stories, but I've had situations where I've used in fairly short reviews said nothing but damning remarks, and I've used one word to be gently, suggestive that this is not the abomination of all time, and that one word it becomes. One time I said this show is terrible. There are some exquisite harmonies in the second act.
I'm going to have
the next day, I look in the paper, exquisite exclamation point.
Usually funny. If you say anything is funny, even if it's Long Day's Journey, there will be funny exclamation.
They want that. They want all our approval.
We have
but
some
they want
questions from the audience.
Okay. What?
Okay.
Shut us up.
I have one quick question, which might be loaded, but I'm going to ask anyway. In our performance seminar, we constantly hear that an actor or playwright or director has to do this in the theater, or cannot do anything else. I'm going to let you mull this over. Do you feel that way about being a theater critic? Do you feel that way about the theater? That even if you didn't get free tickets, that you would go to the theater because that's what you love? Having said that, I'm going to let you think about it and let our audience come through and ask the questions that they're ready to ask. Did you come through?
Yes, I was wondering, how can one make a living as a theater critic?
Not easily.
I mean, it's not just a theater ticket. You've got to make a living.
We would refer you to our editors, basically, for that answer to that, I think.
It's a narrow field.
You mean how does one get started as a theater critic?
And make a living, actually get paid a salary.
It's an increasingly pathetic job market.
I can't imagine that any of us, did any of us think when you were 15 or 16 years old that you were going to be a theater critic? Or
I was going to be a veterinarian.
I mean, it's something you fall, these jobs open up, like Brigadoon, once a century. And I think that, I think it just falls to you. I think it's really, I know there was like a 14-year-old student at some high school in New York who wrote me and said, your re-review of Rent was horrific. Basically gave me his review and wants to be a theater critic. And I thought, he'll never be, I mean, if you want to, I don't think you ever will be. I mean, unless you really have incredible fortitude. But I wouldn't, I don't even think there's a program. Is there a program to train theater critics anymore?
Sure. Well, yeah, I teach a criticism class at Columbia, but it's not really to train critics. I don't think it's a very hard job market. And Time and Newsweek used to regularly, every single week, have a full page for theater. Very, very seldom do they have theater reviews now, and often they're like this. Every TV station, when I moved here in '80, had the theater review the night of the opening. And I thought, what a wonderful place this is, that the theater's important enough that on a half-an-hour news that there would be. Very few of them do now. There is much, newspapers are dying, newspapers are consolidating and laying people off, and the political climate of the last 20, 15 years has successfully marginalized the arts so much that both the public and editors have a tendency to think that the arts are much less important.
But in closing,
except for New York One,
I'll make this brief. No, I think it is very difficult to aim to become a theater critic. You have to be within the right setting. For example, if you're at the Times, and as Peter said, he started out as a reporter. You have to be within that milieu, in order to get noticed. And I think it's pretty similar with all of us here.
And I think that's true on television too.
Certainly true.
They take you out.
My name is Robert Camelot. My question is directed at the entire panel. Do you have different standards of criticism, either consciously or subconsciously, when reviewing a show on Broadway, off Broadway, or in non-profit institutional theaters?
Different standards.
Well, I don't know about my subconscious. Who knows what it's doing out there? Yeah, I think inevitably you do, because you know that expectations are very high when people are paying $75, $80, even $90 now a ticket. I think, for instance, there's a show that's opening on Broadway tomorrow night, I think, that opened 10 years ago off Broadway. And in my review, I made the point that off Broadway 10 years ago, there was something about this that might have had a certain amount of charm. But when people are expected to pay $65 a ticket, I don't want my words, which they don't often, but appearing over the over the title saying brilliant. You do bring different standards. I mean, I think you'd all agree.
I don't know. I don't think I always feel like I left my yardstick in my other purse. I always think, people are always talking about standards. I mean, I think that there's no way that I'm going to say I like something that I don't like, but possibly the tone. The tone, using, a cannon to shoot a fly. You don't want to be a bully, but there's no reason. Can I string some more cliches together? I think so. I think so that, there's no reason to beat a horse to know it's dead, or fill those in. But you have a sense of proportion.
Mm-hmm. It's a purely subjective business we're in. I mean, that's the bottom line. You can't. You bring all the, as I said. I mean, you bring your expectation level, the normal variety of expectations you have to any two events in your life, to any two nights in the theater.
We have another question.
Let me make a comment first, and that is, I think that theater goers are making a big mistake if they rely on just one critic. And I'm a professor sitting in City University in an English department, but my PhD's in theater. So everybody comes to me and says, "Did you hear about the new play?" And they're always reading the Times. Well, I don't read the Times until I go home. I read Linda Weiner coming in on the train, and so I have a different opinion.
I'll pay you later.
I said, you really shouldn't go by just one critic. Well, my question is that we hear an awful lot of talk, especially from politicians, about what we ought to think and what we ought to see and what we ought to do, and there's been a lot of questions and comments about censorship just recently. And I'm just wondering if there's, I think most of you are very open-minded. You have to be if you're going to be critics. And liberal and open-minded people say, you know, let anything go, as opposed to the ones who only want us to think what they think. Is there any circumstances when there could be or should be censorship in the theater?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question.
I think that would have to come at the beginning of the seminar.
For me, the only one would be if you actually physically harmed something on the stage. Otherwise, I think, you know, you might think
those dogs or children that you were talking
yeah,
about.
as long as no one is not, as long as it's not a snuff play, you know, or then I think that that you may find a point of view repugnant, but you know, I want to see it, or I want to have the right to not see it.
Anybody feel differently?
I'd rather answer Isabel's question about like whether you like the theater or not.
All right, please answer my question. Do you all love the theater? Let's start with that way.
I mean, it's an easy question to answer. I think that none of us would be doing this. I think I can speak for everybody, and
Unless
they
you're
will speak for
masochist.
themselves. If we didn't adore this art form, and when it's great, there's nothing like it.
Absolutely.
There's no exhilarating experience, and I think I live for those few occasions when it moves me beyond any human capacity to do. It's a superhuman feeling, and that's the quest constantly in this job.
You don't use that term lightly, I know, those few occasions. Because when you think about it, of all the shows that we see, how many openings are there in a year? 40, maybe, whatever. Of that, the percentage is so high that the plays are not going to be very good. And yet, you live, I guess we're idealists by nature, you live for that moment when you're going to see something that is just so transporting, you know, that changes your life. And there have been quite a few.
Yeah, there was a critic in Chicago for many years named Claudia Cassidy, who was a theater, dance, and music critic of the Chicago Tribune, and just died recently at the age of 97.
Talk about influence.
And Claudia once was saying to me that she says, I became addicted to the idea of curtains about to go up or about to be raised. I'm sure she said it more gracefully than that, but I think that's what it is. You sit there and you think, maybe this time.
That's a wonderful way to hear, maybe this time, because I think that's the excitement that we talk about when you go into the theater that's unlike anything else, the rustle of the program and the waiting for either the first chord of the orchestra or the curtain to go up. There is maybe this time, and even if it isn't this time, there is still something that is very magical and very wonderful about live professional theater. And on that note, which is what you wake me up in the middle of the night, I will say that as well, because I love the theater, and most everybody that's been part of our panels feels the same way, and the audience that is here. I'm Isabel Stevenson, and I'm part of the American Theater Wing. I'm a member of the board of directors of the American Theater Wing, and I'm delighted to be able to bring this seminar from the new Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And the seminar on working in the theater has been on the critics, their role, and as I found out from tonight, from this afternoon, they are very deeply involved and they deeply care about the theater as well. And I'm very proud to have had them here and grateful to them. Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you.